Danny Ashton przed wami. Enjoy.
So when I was pitching this presentation to the guys here, all the talk within the SEO community was all about persona, the persona-driven approach. So finding your persona and creating content that's specifically aimed at that. So I thought, I'll include that in my presentation and it'll give me more of a chance of these guys hopefully accepting what I say. And the good news is that it's worked. I'm here with you today and I'm able to kind of talk to you about this stuff. But there was a slight problem. And many of you will probably relate to this, when I was working on the presentation and going through all the different steps, the research and the analysis, persona was really being a stumbling block. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's quite unclear. And really, when I was going through the process, what I was really trying to do was creating content that gets human beings to take an action. So whether that's to share something on Twitter or Facebook, or a journalist to kind of create a story, and that's really what we're targeting. It's a human success content. So it is slightly different to my original idea, but I'm really confident that this concept is a lot clearer and that you're all going to get a lot from this. But before we start, I want to give a quick test. You've had your coffee, so you haven't got any excuse. And I want to this is the biggest screen I've ever seen. I'm going to show you something. This was meant for a slightly smaller screen, so hopefully it'll still work. And I'm going to give you 3 seconds to analyze it. 1, 2, 3. Now that was probably quite hard because the way our brains are wired, it takes us time to understand text. And we know that when we're reading, a book that's kind of difficult, it takes time. You might have to reread pages, passages. And there's a reason for this, and that is that mass reading on a kind of mass scale didn't really start until the 15th century, when we moved from manuscripts to printed books. And even then, there wasn't that many people doing it. And on an evolutionary scale, that's really short. So the way that our brains have developed and the way they've wired is still stuck in. We haven't had the time to adjust to this new type of media. So we can still process it, but it does take time. Now I'll give you 3 seconds to look at this. Now, that was a lot easier, and my slide did fail, but anyway, because you needed 1/10 of a second to process that image. You didn't need to kind of spend any sort of time. You knew what that was straight away. You knew that there was a warning and rocks were falling. Exactly what the slide beforehand. And there's a reason behind this, very similar to the reason I gave for why it took us a lot longer to understand the text. And that is, when we look at visuals, if we put it on an evolutionary scale, it's far longer. And they found fossils of an eye, and not a human eye, definitely, but fossils of an eye, a cell that uses visual information to process, going back as far as 40 million years. So on that scale, that timeline, we can see that the development is far longer. And because of that, our brains have developed, adjusted through evolution to actually be able to process images far, far quicker than text. Oh man, I'm going to try to remember it. Dzień dobry. My name is Danny Ashton, and I had to practice that a lot. And I run Neomam Studios, and we're based in the UK, and we're a visual content agency. For the reasons that I've just explained, visual information is far quicker for us to digest, and so it's far quicker for us to get results with it. Now, over the past 5 years, I, in some way, in our agencies, have been involved in content. And from the kind of early days of doing link-bait articles, so these are kind of text and images combined with nice headlines that share well. And over this time, we've developed and we've evolved to what is now the infographic format. And what I really wanted to do with this presentation today was really show you how we've evolved and some of the things that have started to happen. Now, over the last 3 years, Neomam is only just under 3 years old. In the early days, we had some really great wins. So we've got a payday loan company on Wired, which was something we didn't expect. And we've had placements on the big Gawker network sites like Gizmodo. But the problem was that our results were still very inconsistent. So we would get one great win one week, and then the next week, maybe not so much. And that was, for me personally, I was never really comfortable with that. And I always felt that there was something more we could do. But as an industry, that was kind of an accepted way of working, that you were kind of playing for that one big win, and in between there, you'd have to accept the stuff that didn't really work, which was fine, and I was starting to kind of deal with that. But then recently, and this is over the last 12 months, things have really started to change. And the things that have changed is that journalists at major newspapers from around the world have started hitting our agency up, asking us for our content, which for someone who's been in outreach for many years, in my entire career, this is really strange. I used to spend all my time begging, offering incentives, and just trying to really bend the arms of journalists to cover our content. And the opposite was happening. They were coming to us and really kind of ringing the office up and saying, look, we need it now. And so what I really want to do with today's presentation was have a look and go back and look at what's changed over the last 12 months that's meant that journalists have started speaking to us, where we're not always inconsistent with our results. We're really confident in what's happening. And the reason I'm doing it is to really, so you guys here can take our learnings, and we've been involved in this in format and visual content for a long time. And we've made some mistakes, and we've made some experiences. And hopefully I can create a framework that's easy for you to follow, and that you're able to kind of start off where we are now, rather than having to go through that whole process, those kind of years of hard graft, really. So in building this framework, we have to start somewhere. And what we're really after, we want to speak to humans. And when we speak to humans, there's one part of the human that we want to speak to, and that's the brain. Because all of us, whether subconsciously or consciously, our brain is defining our actions and the way we see the world. And I really wanted to find a way that we can go direct to the source. And the great thing is that there's already a study of brains and how they work, and that is neuroscience. And I will say to you all in the room, I haven't got a degree in neuroscience. I'm certainly not a professor or have a PhD, but I have had an amateur interest in the subject, and always have. And it's something that I thought if we could combine some of the frameworks that are used in neuroscience with the visual content creation, then we could really create something that we could all follow and work with. And one of the frameworks in neuroscience, which I really related to, and our agency especially did, was the triune brain theory, which is really just the three-brain theory, where we have the oldest of our brains, the reptilian brain. We have the limbic brain, which is the next evolution up, and then we have the neo-mammalian brain, which is our youngest brain. And as you can probably guess, that is what we based our agency name on. We were so kind of taken with this theory, so it's only right that I use this theory to explain our success that's been happening. Now, when we look at this, the way the triune brain works, and when we start to kind of match this with content, we have some really interesting things start to happen. So if we imagine we use each of these different types of brain with content we consume on the web, if we start with the reptilian brain, we're looking at consumption that's happening instinctive. We're not spending time to think about it. It's also interested in really a couple of key core subjects. That is danger, that is sex, and it's survival. And pretty much if we look on the web, it kind of explains why still a vast amount of the web today, we have obviously pornography, we have celebrity content. And one of the key features of reptilian content is it doesn't really range in complexity. You know, the pornography film still has the same subjects than it did when it first came out. And there isn't really that complexity when it comes to celebrity gossip. It's the same very base, very uncomplex way it works. But we engage with it very quickly. If we look at the limbic brain, that is the way that we deal with, on an emotional level, to content on the web. And again, it happens subconsciously. We're not thinking about it. We're not engaging our brains to work with it. But it isn't the same for everyone as well. So with limbic or emotional content, it's different for every audience. I might be engaged with a certain piece of content in an emotion that works for me, but you might be completely different and it wouldn't work with you. So there is a slight benefit to that because then we can start engaging different groups. And when it comes to complexity, it differs. We can have some very complex emotional content. We can have some very simple content. So it does range from a massive degree. And then when we come to the neo-mammalian brain, this is really content from a web user point of view. 99% of them are not using this part of the brain, their top brain, when they consume content. This is the brain that we really have to engage to work with. We have to think, we have to sit down. If you've put together a presentation, you've got ready for an exam, you've sat in an exam hall, this is the part of the brain that you're using. And the average person on Facebook or Reddit, they're not really looking to engage with that. But it's still an important part of the framework, and I'll explain a little bit why. Now, what happens when we apply this triune brain theory to content is that we can create this really nice diagram. And what we're looking at is population across the bottom, which is the amount of the population that consumes this content versus the complexity of the content. Now, looking at this quickly, we can see that reptilian content, and we can see this by the vast sales of tabloid newspapers, tabloid magazines, it's really hitting the widest range of people possible. When we have the neo-mammalian type content, which is a very small amount. And when we come to complexity, and this can be kind of a confusing thing, especially when I was practicing and getting feedback from people, it's not that confusing, though, when we apply it to content, because what we're really looking at is how much money we spend. Here, we hardly spend anything, and here we're spending vast amounts of money. So we can see that reptilian content on here is hitting everyone, but has really low levels of complexity, so is cheap. So looking at this diagram, we think, well, why don't we just create reptilian content? It's cheap, and it hits everyone, and it'll get us the results that we want. And if we take a look on the web, and this is one day on the Mail Online, a UK tabloid newspaper, which I think is the biggest online newspaper in the world, we can see that this type of reptilian content is everywhere. From the girl clobbing her rival in the head with a shovel, to the terrifying moment when a man is knocked down and dragged by a ghost. And you can really engage with this content and see what happens. And it is getting page views. They're really promoting this on the site. They're getting lots of people onto it, and it's really working for them. So looking at publishers, yeah, it's not a bad thing. Well, let's do some reptilian content. But there is two clear problems, and I'm just going to go through each of these now so we can understand. The first one is brand reputation. Now, many of our clients and many of you in the room will have a brand in some way. And a brand takes time, it takes money, and it's something you really want to protect against. Because you don't want a brand, you can lose a brand overnight, and you really need to be conservative. And the problem with reptilian content, whether it's aimed at sex, survival, or ghost dragging men down the street, is that brands don't really want to be related to that content, because it is risky. Certainly, it can get the coverage, but if it goes wrong, then really your brand can lose a lot of value. But that's not really a question for me, but certainly something of interest if you do have a brand. But my main problem is audience. Now, if we create reptilian content, we need to make sure, as with any content, to get a return on investment, is that people see it. And for people to see it, we need an audience. And so we have a choice, really. Firstly, I want to ask a question to you guys in the room. Just a show of hands, really. If someone could press a button right now and get their content in front of, say, 100,000 people, who can do that? There's one person. There's always one. I don't know. You might have a mailing list that can do it, but in general, none of us have that power. Even agencies that have been working in this a long time, we can't just press a button and get our content out there. Unless you're a publisher, unless you own a tabloid newspaper. So the option that you have, once you've created reptilian content, celebrity gossip, or something that's going to engage the reptilian part of the brain, is that to get it out there, you really need to pay for people to see it. And I've given one example here, which is we've been using Outbrain to support our paid amplification effort. And it's certainly very useful. But if we look at trying to get reptilian content out there, if we estimate that the average viewer for Outbrain is about 10 pence, and looking back over our kind of successes, we need at least 100,000 people to really see that, to really engage an effect that's going to lead to placements and lead to all the goals of the client. And so we're looking at about a £10,000 budget on outreach. Now, even at the level that we're working for, there's no way we could ever sell that into a client, especially when we can't guarantee anything with that. All we're getting is eyeballs on the page. So until we can get 10 grand budgets on outreach, the only other option is to use existing audiences. And that is what many of us have probably already done, whether we work in SEO, content marketing. And that is speaking or finding audiences that already exist. So blogs, newspapers, magazines, and having our content in front of them and getting them to share it for their audience at no cost to us. Now, if we go back to reptilian content, here's where the problem is. Now, with any content, to get it featured on a magazine, a publisher, anyone, it has to be better than the stuff they're already producing. Just a little bit better so that they will give you the opportunity. Now, the problem with reptilian content is that you're going to aim this at the tabloid newspapers, the magazines, and when we look at these publishers, they've been involved in reptilian content since many of us have been born. They have more money, more experience, and they've got reptilian content down to a fine art. So on a limited content budget, there's no real way we can compete with the stuff they're already producing. And so it really isn't an option. But that doesn't mean that reptilian content can't be done. And there's a great example, I don't know if great's the right word, but a casino did a permanent tattoo on a single mother in America to get goldenpalace.com on her head. And they got exposure from across the web, millions of pounds of kind of exposure and impressions. And it certainly is reptilian content. But there's a problem in that it's not scalable. This happened in 2007. I spent some time researching to see if anyone else had redone it. They hadn't. It also, is it right for every brand? I'd find that many brands would just run a mile away from that. And there's also potential ethical issues, which I'll leave with you. So we've covered the reptilian and why we don't really want to target reptilian. Now we're coming back to the next stage up. So it targets the most amount of people, and its complexity ranges. And that is kind of limbic content. Now, I did have a video, and sadly we can't play it, but I'll give you a showreel which will hardly help. Whereas a woman is singing to a baby, and the baby can't talk, and yet it emotionally responds to the story that the mother tells her. So as he's talking about the good stuff, the baby laughs, and when it gets to the sad stuff, the baby cries, which doesn't quite work as well. But certainly what we're seeing with this is that from the day we're born, we're hardwired to emotionally relate to others. And that's inbuilt into us. But it's not the same for everyone. Unlike reptilian content, where I could show some reptilian content, you would all engage with it in the same way, emotional content, limbic-focused content is different for everyone. So I did a bit of an analysis, looking at Reddit, looking at content that is shared well for different audiences and had a look at it. So this one's for a parenting audience, and definitely it's shared well within this specific audience, and it may share well with you. This is for gadgets, and this is definitely something that I relate to a lot more, that many of you may find confusing, because just kind of looking at the nostalgia element of how things have changed. And there's still an emotion. It might not be what would engage the parents, but it definitely engages the gadget crowd. And we also have the guys who are into cars and autos. And again, the emotional response of the content that works for them is completely different. They like to laugh at people with small cars, which, I don't know. But don't just take my word for it. There's been so many different studies looking at the way emotional content works. This particular study from an agency over in the US, Fractal, studied different images that shared on Reddit and analyzed what were the emotions. And lots of powerful emotions that were kind of like happiness, delight, joy, really showed up as something that drove that content to share well. And also the New York Times did a study, and they were looking at at the end of an article, you've got the ability to email others. And they looked at what was the subject matter and what were the emotional responses of the article and how well that shared. And the interesting thing with this, and certainly when I first started out, I thought that only positive emotions help to share content. But the studies, and there's been many studies since, is that actually it doesn't really matter. Even negative ones like anxiety and anger can really engage people within a certain audience to share that content. And if you're interested in more, there's a book, Contagious, by Jonah Berger, which goes into detail of how emotions affect word of mouth, whether online or offline. And he goes into a massive study, and certainly it's well worth a read. And if we look on the web, it's everywhere that this limbic-focused content has really been taking the web by storm. All it needs is a kind of a quick look at sites that have been doing really well over the last couple of years, sites like BuzzFeed and Upworthy, where they've always been engaging that limbic part of our brains, because they know that it will mean that content will be shared, whether through social media, through word of mouth, so they don't have to have those massive advertising budgets. And certainly there's been some rejection of this over time, but you can't, if you look at these sites and look at their search scores, the amount of links that they've driven, you can see how the emotional content's worked really well. So then we come to the final bit, the neo-mammalian brain. And as I told you before, it's not really, most of the web users consuming content are really engaging with this type of brain. But it is important for one reason. And that is when we come to actually get our content out there, and if we are going down a limbic approach, we still need to get our content in front of the right people. And when we talk about the right people, we're talking about publishers. So whether it's Time, whether it's the Metro, whether it's the Mail Online, these are made up of different people with human brains. Now, their primary interest will be limbic in focus. They know that their audience wants emotional content because that's going to share well, it's going to get them results. But unlike the average internet user, there is consequences of them sharing their content with their audience. And we like to call these journalists the gatekeepers. They really control which content gets in front of their people. And the reason there's a consequence is that if a journalist shares content that seems to be wrong, false, spurious, it's really going to have an effect on them. It doesn't really matter to you when you're hitting Facebook tweets but for a journalist, if they feature the wrong story, they can have professional consequences. They might lose their job, they'll lose their reputation in front of the people that feel for them. And so they really have to analyze, critically evaluate, and use all those neo-mammalian type brain functions when they're looking at content. So we really need to make sure that we're engaging that part of the brain as well, especially if you want to get access to these audiences for low advertising costs. So just to kind of cover this section, we really want to have a human-oriented approach, start looking at the brain, because that's where we want to target. And we also want to have an emotional focus, because it shares well. It's also different for different audiences. But we still need to deal with the neo-mammalian concerns, because otherwise we won't have access to these journalists. And the great thing is when we do this right and we follow this framework, then we can access all these massive audiences at a really low cost. Now, I think I go to a lot of conferences, and often the problem is we can talk a lot about theory, and actually it's quite hard, and for me personally, I find it quite hard to kind of take that into the real world. So what I really want to do with the next kind of less than half of the presentation is really apply this framework to pieces of content that we've done that succeeded, that we've really based this framework on. Because I think if you see it in the real world and you see it used in practice, then I certainly think it really helps you to understand. But first, I do need to make a confession, and that is when we talked about the reptilian content, we certainly shouldn't have it as our primary focus for the reasons I mentioned about audience and brand reputation. But the reptilian brain is always there. It's here right now, and we need to deal with it because it really defines our interest. So if someone gets a tweet or an email, that reptilian brain is going to engage whether they click it or not. So we really need to find ways of dealing with it. And the way that we've kind of dealt with this is called the 3-second test. And that is if we show some content to people and they can't understand it in 3 seconds, then it hasn't done its job. And the reptilian part of the brain is really going to ignore that and going to move on. So that's the reason why we use a lot of visuals, because of the reasons I mentioned at the start. We process that far quicker, and we're going to pass the 3-second test far easier. And there's also the issues of titles. There's many kind of discussions at other conferences about real big publishers test their titles like sometimes up to 35 different times because they know how important that initial title is, especially to that reptilian part of the brain. And so when you have created content, you've come up with an idea, don't just go with the first title that you've done. Think about what can you do to improve, to create uncertainty, to create a possible easy benefit, to really get the reptilian brain on side so they can go a little deeper with your content, engage with it on an emotional level. So, yeah, 35 rewrites might be a bit intense, but I think definitely a couple sharing them with the office is a good way about it. So the first case study I want to share with you today is for a travel client of ours. They really wanted to target kind of young travelers, so looking at people under 30, and they want to really be on the relevancy scale, and there's been lots of kind of discussion about this at Moz and showing the way that works, is that we don't want to just be relevant to our current customers, but anyone who's connected to our potential customers, which you could do a whole presentation on it, but just worth mentioning. So the first thing we do with following my framework is really look at the content in this space, in this audience that we want to speak to, and try and find out what is the emotional nature of this audience. And certainly looking at the places that our audience is frequenting and looking at the type of content, we really can find out that the discovery and kind of the emotion of wonder about the world and the world around us is certainly something that really seems to be part of the content that shares well with this particular audience. And we also need to have a look at publishers, because we don't have the budget to just spend 10,000 on pushing it. We really need to know that publishers are already talking about this. And looking at a tool, this is BuzzSumo, an amazing tool which is free, we can see that the type of content that relates to this emotion is sharing well with a wide range of publishers, as well as actually getting some really good social shares as well. Now, the next step is to brainstorm content. And again, there's been lots of presentations, and I could probably do another hour presentation on the ways you could do this. And you'll probably all have your ways of doing it. But the main thing is that we're actually using that limbic response to really evaluate the ideas that come through. Is it matching up to that emotion that we know works well with our particular audience? And there's lots of different potential sources of information. You've got places like BuzzSumo, Google News, and probably a large range of sites that you have to find that emotional content that's done well, and you can add that into your process that you do for ideas. And with any brainstorming, you've got to ask yourself questions about your audience. So what do they do on vacation? What do they think about? What's their worries? What's their concerns? The whole process that you go through. And really use that as a way to kind of find your ideas. And just an examples of way to do this, looking at things like food, you can have different foods from around the world. There's all different ideas, and you'll go through this process breaking down. But the most important thing is you're looking for any of those ideas that really identify with the emotion of discovery and wonder. And the idea that we came up with, following a kind of a long process and primarily targeting at the emotional response that we're looking for, was 12 curious cures for a hangover. Now, the first thing we need to deal with any content is to deal with the reptilian concerns. It's always going to be something that's there that's going to put off people from really engaging deeper into our content. And the way that we did this was to make sure that we weren't just producing an infographic that was just purely text. We wanted to let the images tell the story of each of the different places, because we knew that people can process that quicker. We passed the 3-second test. We also used a list in the title, and this creates that uncertainty of what else there is and what more there is to learn. And to deal with the neo-mammalian concerns, this is something we've been doing for the last 6 months, which has certainly been really helpful. And that is that when we produce our content for the first time, before we go to outreach, before we speak to journalists, we share it on the image sharing site Imgur, and then we promote that through Reddit, just submit it to certain subreddits. And all our key goal is to get as many people as possible to look at it and really give us their critical evaluation. And the great thing is with an audience of Reddit is they don't really care for us, they don't know who we are, and they're happy to rip apart your content. And we then will take on board what they say and be able to improve that content before we speak to those gatekeepers who are really going to evaluate it. So we can kind of deal with any of the potential neo-mammalian concerns before it even happens. And the benefit of this process that we do is that you can actually get some social proof as well, that you can, when you go to publishers, you can tell them that you've had a couple of thousand people already evaluate this content, what they've thought of it, and how you've improved it. So they really know that there's an audience for this content and that they're confident in what can happen. And the results for this infographic and the reason that we included it was that we got massive amounts of results that we didn't really expect. And these were kind of journalists actually outreaching to us and speaking to us, but also all across the web, really. And certainly for our clients, that is their prime concern. But for me, and looking forward to the future, what I really care about, and something that maybe as an industry we haven't cared about as much, is really the human interaction that's happening. So what are real people doing? And so with every one of our projects, we look in a little bit deeper. So we look at the placements that we achieve, and we look at what are people doing on those placements. And the great results from this one was that when we were getting featured on the Mail Online, there was lots of comments, there was lots of interaction, lots of shares that were happening. And we actually saw, even just pulling into BuzzSumo, we can see that each of the placements are benefiting from the actual initial content. And that's really something to keep in mind, is that when you are outreaching content to journalists, they really need to benefit from that. Because otherwise, if they don't benefit in any way, then they're not going to really build that relationship to you, because you don't really have anything that they need. So the second case study was for a different audience, completely different audience with a different emotional response. They really wanted to target Pinterest, home decor. They sold fabrics, so completely different from the young travel market. And we, again, needed to deal with this process. And one of the ideas that we came up with was the ultimate towel folding guide. And we looked at, there was about 8 different animals that you could make with your towel, and we wanted to, we dealt with the reptilian part of the brain by just having, again, visuals to tell the story. People didn't have to sit down and read it, and so they could process it very quickly. And also with the emotional, obviously the idea was quite emotional in its very essence, but also we wanted to improve that emotional response by using illustrations that really fed well with that audience that we were speaking to. The Pinterest crowd was really who we wanted to speak to. The analysis showed them that they liked playful, emotional content, and we really needed just to give it to them. And again, we had some really nice results. So Pinterest, even today, we see that it's been repinned, reshared, and I think we've had kind of nearly like 180,000 views, unique visitors that the client got from this one infographic, which was completely unexpected for them. And even within within a placements point of view, we had places like Design Taxi, places that we didn't expect that were going to cover it, as well as 8 months later, a journalist at the Washington Post speaking to us about featuring it, which again kind of blew our mind on, we were just completely unexpected that would work. But again, what I'm really interested in is the real human action that happens. And when we got told by the Washington Post that they were going to feature our infographic, they also showed us that they tried it out themselves. They got the towel out in the office and made a swan, and it worked. So that kind of dealt with the potential neo-mammalian concerns, which is, does it really work? Are we just telling them some designs that we just found on the internet, or are we actually creating something that's real that they can really test out for themselves? And again, they will share that, and it achieves a lot of greatness. And it is just kind of cool to imagine a guy at the Washington Post making swans out of towels that we told him to. So I kind of like that. So the whole point was that we found what the emotional response was for each of the audience that we were targeting. And when we did the ideas process, then we really were looking for those emotional responses and really putting away anything that really didn't engage emotionally with the audience that we want to speak to, as well as dealing with the reptilian and neo-mammalian concerns. If we do that, then that's when we start to get results every single time. Now, interactive content is talked about a lot, and it has been for probably the last year and a bit. And certainly, when interactive content first appeared, as the owner of an infographic agency, I was really keen to not miss the boat. But we waited a long time, probably a lot longer than many other agencies. And the reason was we didn't want to kind of rush into a new format. We knew that we were kind of working with a certain format, with the static infographic. But there is, if anyone's kind of seen me at conferences, if anyone says anything bad about infographics, I'm really quite bad about shouting at them, whether it's in the conference or whether it's on websites, and generally just being annoying when people say they're bad, because I really do believe in the format. But there is a problem with them. And I hope that we can just keep that all in here today, because we sell a lot of infographics. And the problem is this thing here. We have the sources at the end of every infographic. And a static infographic is an image. And the big problem is that all these URLs, you can't click on them. You have to type them out by hand or take a photo. Or I don't even know if you can even possibly do that and if you would be bothered. And even a great publisher is not going to go through that process. So the problem is that when we send an infographic to a publisher, they don't know whether we're just making our research up. And there's a real problem that we had, and something that we dealt with over the years by only promoting our own infographics so we were confident and building that reputation over time. But that's certainly something you guys can't just scale up and start doing tomorrow. And that's where our first interactive content came in. Because we wanted to deal with this problem in an easier way than building an infographic agency and spending 2 years. And that was having, next to any fact that we mentioned, we put a little URL hyperlink that when you pressed it, it would take you down to the end of the infographic and give you the URLs that took you to the specific sections of the books or the sources that were used. And that meant that any sort of gatekeeper or journalist could really know and be confident that what we said was real. He didn't just have to take our word or trust us. And some other things that we'd like to play with as well that were interesting was just adding these Twitter buttons. And in the grand kind of budget concern of how much the infographic cost, these cost next to nothing, but these are what really got us the results that we really didn't expect. And even this was taken probably about 4 days ago, and we're still getting 5, 6, 7, 8 tweets per day 10 months after the infographic went live, which if you really do reduce that barrier to people, as well as deal with the concerns about whether it's real or not, people will share on a regular basis. And we also got lots of placements. And as a link builder and been involved in SEO for a while, and certainly as it was on our agency site, it had certain benefits. So we're looking at now 558 referring domains, which I think is probably the biggest amount of links we've got with one piece of work. But again, what I really care about is the interaction. So what do the humans do? And we've used tools like Topsy. We use tools like Social Site Explorer to have a look at how many shares are happening. And certainly we were getting shares within social sites that we didn't even have an interest in. Things like LinkedIn, things like Google+. We've never really set any pages. We never did any promotion on that. But certainly people were utilizing that and sharing that with their framework. Because once we'd achieved that limbic response, we'd dealt with the reptilian concerns with the title, as well as having hardcore kind of neo-mammalian proof through the URLs and the sources, then we started to get really great things started to happen. Now, one of the neo-mammalian brain reactions that I was really proud of that I wanted to share with everyone was, this is only a month or two ago, was the Harvard Business Review actually featured it as a source of information for their readers, which in the grand scale of publishers, you might have the likes of Mashable down here, and no offense to anyone who works at Mashable, but then you've got the Harvard Business Review is pretty much at the top of that pile. And so that we were able to utilize the technology to have them to trust in our content was really great. Great long-term benefits. We now rank for infographics on the second page, interactive infographics on the first page. But it's worth mentioning, it's not the magic bullet. You can't just add interactivity. Without the framework, without all the kind of the emotional, the reptilian, and the neo-mammalian brain concerns, you're not really going to get anywhere, and it's just going to be really expensive failure. So just to summarize, because I know I'm coming up to time now, is you need to identify the emotional hooks for the audience that you want to speak to. So if you're an agency, you want to look at your clients. If you're the client, then you want to really identify what are the emotional hooks, what are the hooks that are happening. But then you also need to fact check, evaluate, invest in the content as much as you can afford to make sure it is at a level where those gatekeepers, those publishers are really going to allow that to match up to their audience. And finally, you need to seduce the reptilian brain. It's still always there. We still have to deal with it. You use things like the 3-second test, using images over text, but also using titles to really engage people before they even go a little deeper into the content. Let me break. Perfect. Thank you for listening.